So, can an adult with a full time job, no prior musical experience, and no family members who play music really learn to play an instrument? Is it really true that you need to be young and talented to learn music? Of course not. Anyone can learn to play music at any age. And yet, to this day, many people still don't believe that to be true. Why is this? How did we come to believe the myth that musical ability was innate and that it could only be learned when we were young? And how is it that we now know that these things aren't true? That's the topic for today's episode. So my book, Anyone Can Play Music, is now officially out, available wherever books are sold. There's also a link to it in the description. The subtitle is How to Release Your Musical Potential with the Laws of Brainjo. As some of you know, this book is an updated and expanded edition of a book that I released 5 years ago entitled The Laws of Brainjo. And in this episode, I wanted to back up to the beginning to share a little bit of the story of how this book and how the Brainjo project came to be in the first place. So way back in 1913, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, considered to be the father of modern neuroscience, said, "In adult centers, the nerve paths are something fixed, ended, immutable. Everything may die, nothing may be regenerated." In other words, adult brains could not change. The adult brain was fixed in its form and function. In some respects, this made sense given what was known at the time. If you damaged the brain, it seemed like the effects were permanent, and early studies seemed to confirm this view. Now, this is a pretty extraordinary and impactful claim because if it's true, it means that brain injury is irreversible, that learning capacity declines sharply with age, and that the brain's fundamental structure is set in stone after childhood. But this did become the dogma in neuroscience for much of the 20th century, and it's of course relevant for anyone who's wanting to learn a complex skill like music, especially as an adult. And that's because all learning requires brain change. So if your brain doesn't change as an adult, then it's kind of pointless to try learning new skills. And the term for this kind of change is neuroplasticity, or just plasticity. And so the prevailing dogma was that plasticity only happened when you were a kid. And the science overall seemed to support the adage that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Now, the first hints that this doctrine might be wrong came in the 1960s when researchers studying animals found some surprising evidence of structural changes in adult brains. But those findings were initially dismissed as just experimental artifacts. But then in the 1970s, research in this area really started to pick up when Dr. Michael Merzenich, who's been referred to now as the father of neuroplasticity, when he and his colleagues performed multiple studies on animals that demonstrated that the adult brain was capable of major restructuring. One of the most noteworthy experiments was done in 1983, where he surgically attached or fused two fingers on a monkey's hand. And after a few weeks, what he found was that the sensory maps in the brain for those fingers had fused together. In other words, the surgery had effectively turned two fingers into a single finger, and now the brain was representing them as a single finger. For that to happen, it meant that major restructuring had occurred in the adult brain. Now, it took a lot of evidence to finally overturn the fixed brain dogma, and Dr. Merzenich and others in this field were met with a great deal of skepticism and even ridicule for years. But thanks to their research and their persistence and conviction, we now know without a doubt that the adult brain is not fixed at all. In fact, our brain is always changing, and this continues as long as we're alive, which is precisely why we can continue to learn complex skills throughout our lives. So by the end of the 20th century, we clearly established that the brain was capable of major change throughout our lives, and so capable of learning complex skills throughout our lives. And yet the science of how the brain changes, or the science of plasticity, had not been applied to how music was taught or learned, or anything else for that matter. In other words, even though all learning requires brain change, the science of how the brain changes had not been integrated into our learning methods. Moreover, the research showed that as a result, many of the approaches that people commonly use to learn were either unproductive or counterproductive. So I first started learning the banjo during my neurology residency over 20 years ago now. And at the time, I was working 80 to 90 hours per week. So maybe could squeeze in, 20 minutes of practice a few times a week if I was lucky. Neither of my parents were musicians, and I was an adult. So according to conventional wisdom, the odds were not in my favor. However, my undergraduate degree was in cognitive neuroscience. I'd done some research in motor learning and was very familiar with the emerging research in plasticity. And so because of that, I was at least somewhat skeptical of that conventional wisdom. And furthermore, my own personal experience growing up playing sports like baseball, basketball, tennis had made me quite suspicious about this idea of innate talent. Because it seemed to me that my skill level was entirely dependent on how much and how well I practiced, and nothing at all to do with any inborn or innate abilities. So both my own direct experience and this emerging science indicated that you got good at things because of the quality and quantity of your practice, not because of anything you were born with. Now, I will say that at this time when I started learning, I was still under the impression that the ability to play music by ear was innate. And that was certainly what most people believed at the time, that you were either born with this ability or you weren't. I had desperately wanted to learn to play the piano growing up and had briefly taken lessons, but I had zero interest in sight reading sheet music. And so learning piano that way was tedious and joyless and was not at all the kind of music making that I was interested in. I wanted to play popular songs. I wanted to play the music that was in my head, and I couldn't find anyone who could help me do that, which only reinforced the myth that playing by ear was something that you either could or couldn't do. And so I went into learning the banjo, thinking that this was still largely true. So anyhow, I start learning during residency, trying to practice smarter to get the most out of my limited time. And I ended up making good progress. I was able to learn songs and techniques faster than I was told I should. And in a few months, I was able to play some songs that I thought would take me maybe years to have learned. So that was all very encouraging. Integrating the science of plasticity seemed to be working out. But I ran into a problem. I was learning almost exclusively from tab. So I was learning to play songs by rote, through step-by-step instructions, but wasn't really developing any other musical skills. As a result, my playing was brittle and rigid. I could only play songs the way I'd learned them. I certainly couldn't, make up my own versions. And my ability to play with others was also very limited. So on the one hand, I'd successfully leveraged plasticity to build these banjo playing neural networks, but the problem was they were the wrong kind of networks. And I'll cover this topic more in depth in the next episode. But there were really two reasons why this happened. One was because, again, I was under the impression that my only choice to learn was to read music of some kind. In this case, it was tab. Again, my childhood experiences and the conventional wisdom had led me to believe that playing by ear was some special innate ability. And two, all of the instructional material that I found was teaching this way of learning by rote, by following step-by-step instructions, either visually with notation or by demonstration. Now, you can learn the patterns of movements needed to play a particular song this way, but that's about all you get. So I decided to basically start over from scratch, to try to learn how to play in a way that relied primarily on my ear and not on any kind of written notation and not by rote. So I wanted to develop the skill of what I now refer to as musical fluency, which is the skill that virtually anyone learning the banjo wants to develop. It seems obvious now that playing by ear not only isn't some innate ability bestowed upon a select few, but is a learned skill like anything else, and that playing by ear is how the vast majority of humans have made music throughout history. We've been making music for tens of thousands of years, and standard musical notation has only been around for about 1,000 years. Also, when you think about it, making music by looking at symbols with our eyes is actually a really strange thing to do, right? Anyhow, I started over from scratch, learned to play by ear, and in the next episode, I'll talk more about what that actually means. And ultimately, doing so not only allowed me to learn to play by ear on the banjo, but allowed me to learn to do so on multiple other instruments, including the piano, which is what I was dying to do all those years ago as a kid. And just as I suspected way back then, it's a much more fulfilling way to make music for me, and allowed me to finally make the music that I wanted to make. So through all of those experiences, it became abundantly clear that the science and my direct experience were at odds with the conventional wisdom. Music ability was not innate. We can learn it at any age. The neurological mechanisms that allowed me to achieve my musical goals exist in every brain. And the reason that it didn't happen more often was because of the myths about innate talents and the limitations of the adult brain, and because of ineffective learning and practice methods that weren't informed by the science of how the brain learns, how the brain changes. And as a result, so many people were being denied the joys of making music. And so many people were vastly underestimating their own potential, not just with music, but with a great many things that they might want to do. And so overturning that conventional wisdom, busting the myth of innate talent with science, and providing people with the information needed to prove it wrong for themselves became my personal mission. That ultimately became the book, which is about how to harness the gift of neuroplasticity to not just mold a musical mind, but to learn anything. There is so much incredible potential in every brain, but most of it goes unrealized because of these silly stories we have about innate abilities, which is not a thing, and because people aren't given the tools and techniques needed to make the most of that gift. And so the book, Anyone Can Play Music, is really about two things. First, it's about the science of why anyone can learn to play music at any age and how to apply that science to do so. And second, it's about how to develop the skill of musical fluency so that you not only learn effectively, but that you actually learn the skills you need to achieve your musical goals. And ultimately, it's really about neuroscience principles that apply to learning anything. Because understanding how to learn is the essential skill needed to unlock your brain's full potential, which again is probably far greater than you realize. So if that sounds of interest to you, then you can now grab the book in whatever format you like, print, ebook, or audio. By the way, I was able to get a little bit of banjo into the audio version, which is not something you'll find in most audiobooks. In the next episode, I'll be talking more about how to ensure that you are following a path to musical fluency. So be sure to subscribe to the podcast or the YouTube channel to catch that one, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for watching this Brainjo Bite. To catch future episodes, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You can also listen to these episodes on the Brainjo Bite podcast. Also, if you'd like to boost your brain health and function with neuroscience-based musical instruction for banjo, ukulele, fiddle, or piano, head over to brainjo.academy.